the Ellicott Ranch. And they had a woman in the 1940s, a guest, Jane Russell and Jack Butel, who were stars of a movie, very highly publicized but censor episode movie. And it was called The Outlaw. And it was one of the first movies where a blouse was slightly open. And Howard Hughes produced it, of course. The famous guest, which isn't very famous, at the McRae Ranch was William Conrad, who had a TV show from 1971 to 1976 called Cannon, about a detective situation. Anyway, I'm going to close this up and tell everyone that I've enjoyed Island Park. I know it breaks me up a little bit because it's such a beautiful area, and the people are so wonderful, as our previous speakers have mentioned, that it's so high in my heart. Excuse me.
That's that connection between the family and land that we wanted to see here. So thank you, Joe. Our next speaker is going to represent the HR Ranch. Tim, is that something you could show us up there?
That ranch no longer exists.
Okay.
But is that was up in this general area.
And so to speak to that, we're very fortunate to have Dennis with us. Please go right ahead. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm Dennis Kennedy. My grandfather, Ralph Perry Kennedy, brought his small family he had 2 children at the time, to Island Park, and he homesteaded where the ranch is, where they showed you earlier. Homesteaded that, and Harry Kennedy was a very enterprising type person. And he started the first rodeo that was on Island Park, in Island Park, and that was about 1925. I'm going to be a little bit gray on these dates because nobody's left around to ask who. So what I'm doing is I'm guessing what had happened, what year it was, and not what happened with the year. He had a guided service. He had a guided service that went into Yellowstone Park, and it lasted up to 10 days. It was the average time that they spent in Yellowstone Park at the time. First one that did that. He took a lot of trips in the Yellowstone Park, and each trip into the park lasted that long, and imagine what he was seeing back then, what the family was. And also, he had cattle on his acreage, and every fall, he would take the cattle down to a place in Egan Ranch. And he'd have his sons, which family was growing by then. He had 2 children to begin with when he came out here, and then he had 7. So I think they went bankrupt, I think, I wonder what he was doing. And his wife's name was Olive, and they had happy operation going there until the Depression struck. They had a hard time fighting it, so he went to a guy that he borrowed the money from, a guy by the name of Jack Adams. And he came to Island Park and saw the potential that my grandfather had, and so he my grandfather, the money for the ranch. And about 1938, my grandfather went to him and he says, I'm gonna give you the title to the ranch because I can't make any money out of it right now. Jack Adams said, you wait till the depression's over, you'll do just fine. And he says, I hate owing money, so here's the title. So he gave the title of the ranch back to Jack Adams. He went to Alaska. And he went to Alaska until, he came back to Island Park one time, and that was in 1951. He came, saw the changes that was happening. He saw his son was building log houses, which he'd been doing since his father left the country, which I did for 44 years. To my knowledge, that's the only time that Harry came back. And you probably remember the story, the old story of Chief Joseph when he went through in his flight to Island Park. Part of the flight was part of McCray Ranch, where I now live. And so those Indians left there, and instead of going over Targhee Pass, he went up another pass. And there's only one person that ever told me that story, and that's my grandfather. He had the car stop. He started telling me, and I was about 8 years old at the time. So my recollection of what he had to say was pretty vivid, but it's still a lot of things I forget. One of them is the year. But I think it was about 51. And he said they went up Twin Creeks. I'm not sure how familiar anybody is with that, but it's where Chief Joseph went. That way he avoided everything. So, I went and saw my grandfather one time when I was in the service. I was in Fort Worth, California, and he was living in Oakland, California at the time. And he said, do not go and see your grandfather because you remember him is not going to be like he used to be. He was a big, strong man. And he was completely bedridden, how they described him to me. And when I went there, I found a house in Oakland, and I walked in, and she said, well, I gotta go get him ready. And they were gone for about 2 or 3 minutes, and out strode my grandfather, just like nothing was wrong with him. Sat down and they talked to me about 45 minutes. And then he went to sleep. And that's the first time he sat and talked to anybody for 2 years. So that was great. It was good to see him that way. And he lived in Oakland, California, and he passed there in 1962. And we brought him to Island Park and buried him at the Targhee Cemetery. I'm going to tell a story that is kind of funny, and part of it involves John's family, with Letches Gordon, and I want to say add one thing, and you forgot one other profession that Sam True did.
What was that?
He played Santa Claus.
How could I miss
That was
that?
his most important thing to do. Anyway, my grandfather went to, and this had happened in about 1940 or somewhere in there, 38. But he went to California to have surgery, and the surgeon was a member of the North Fork Club. And he left, went south and met with Gordon McCray that was showing him around the different movie studios around Hollywood. And the chauffeur was Robert Withridge. Now, Robert used to live up here for years and years, and he was a good old family friend, but he used to live in Switzerland, and he lived a while in the United States. Anyway, he was the chauffeur for my dad and Gordon, which had big hats on, cowboy hats, but they used to wear way back when. And they were going around the studios, and they stopped, and they had a crash with another car. It was a chauffeur-driven car also. My grandfather jumped out of the car he was in, pulled out a flashed out a badge. It was a fishing and game officer badge, but yeah, the car didn't know that. He thought he was a cop. He said, "You're gonna pay for this before we separate." And the guy stuttered a little bit and looked around in the wallet and found enough money to fix this car. And gave it to my grandfather, and my grandfather gave it to Robert Withridge to fix the car he was in, because he wasn't supposed to be in it. He drove this whole car around, and it was from that shop, but it just got repaired. Didn't belong to him. Anyway, that was a story of my grandfather. So, the HK Ranch now is known as the Nicholson Ranch. Thank you.
I do want to add one thing to Dennis's talk. Over here, there's a picture board which has the original brochure for the HK Dude Ranch. And so we spend a couple minutes and look at that before we leave today.
So next up is Garth Blanchard, going to speak to the Lost Homestead. Is that represented on the map there?
It is not.
It would be near the Rigby Ranch there, right in southwest Hubbard, you know.
Up here.
Yeah, a little lower than that. Yeah, down a little.
There it is.
Okay. Well, we'll let you take off. Thank you, Garth.
Well, based on the previous speakers, I try to have the shortest history to talk about. I'll do my best to stretch it out. There you go. The Blanchard arrived in Fremont County in the 1880s as part of the Mormon migration up from Utah. I've been told that that migration is still going on. Most of us descend from a fellow named Alma Moroni Blanchard Sr. And Alma had a large family, and his first wife died. He remarried and had a second large family. My grandfather was from the second family. In fact, he was the youngest son in the second family. And so a lot of the fellows from the first family settled down in the Chester area. So you might know that there's a few Blanchards down in that area. Well, by the time my grandfather came of age, all that property down there was gone. And so in 1923, he and my grandmother Eleanor homesteaded 160 acres up here on Henry's Lake Flats, because that was about all that was left at that particular time. Now, my grandfather died before I was born, so I didn't get a chance to know him. Most of everything that I do know came from stories that my father and my uncle would tell me about this sort of thing. My father was 7 years old in 1923. My Uncle Omer was 6 years older. He was 13. But they went up and they had, of course, prove the homestead. So they built a one-room log cabin up there on the flats. And up until recently, it was still standing up there. The roof's kind of fallen in. Cattle are running through it these days, and there's not a whole lot left to it. But that was their home, and the stories that my father had to tell about it, those were particular days. Now, if you think about it, we all know what winters are like in Island Park, and it's one room log cabin that evidently had a curtain in the middle of it to separate it into two rooms, would basically get buried in the wintertime. And they had to tunnel out, they had to make sure they had air holes, things of that nature. As far as I can tell, based on the stories that I heard, what they did was they were running sheep. So they would bring sheep up from the Rigby area in the springtime, raise them for the summer, and then they'd all get driven back in the fall. But the folks would stay there all winter long. Dad would talk to me about actually running dog sleds, even at his age, out towards Staley Springs and Reynolds Pass. And that's where he got the mail, evidently, was to go that route and go out and pick that sort of stuff up. Some of the other stories they would tell me, there was really good fishing in the outlet those days, even if you didn't have a fishing pole. They also mentioned, interesting enough, they talked about Kennedys. And being up there in the same area with Kennedys and hanging out with them. I have no idea what was going on, but they keep track of those sort of things. So they stayed on the homestead for 5 years as they were supposed to, and they were able to prove that in 1928. And after having spent 5 winters up there and times were tough, within about 6 months, they sold it. I still have a few cheers about that. I'd really like to have that 160 acres up there. But as the thing goes, that's how it works out. Now, I do have a little more history of the Island Park area, not necessarily about 160 acres, but both my parents were born in Ashton, and my mother, as a young teenager, worked at the Trude place as a housemaid, in beds, that type of thing. My father was kind of a roustabout during the Depression and what have you. After that, he ended up working with the CCCs and doing work on the fishing bridge up in Yellowstone and that type of thing. And after that kind of wore out, he ended up being a ranch hand here on the railroad ranch for a while. We took up work wherever we could. So kind of a long history along those lines of being involved. We never were landholders after 1928. I was also born in Ashton and grew up and went to college at the University of Idaho, true blue Vandal. And after graduating, I left to pursue my career, but my heart was always right here. So I understand what you mean. And when I got the opportunity, I came back. This is home, and it's a great place to be. I appreciate everybody's stories for today.
Okay, today, to speak with you about the Rasmussen Farm, which is pointed that out. The boom right there, not too far from where you just left. Sally, come on, thank you.
Well, I sit and listen and I hear lots of different names. Twin Creeks is now Medical Creek. I think of all the stories of growing up here. I don't know how many of you have ever been here for a long time, but it's kind of like an anchor in your life. My grandparents homesteaded here in 31, but they took 2 extra years to prove up because my grandmother was crippled. And so they had a little special dispensation for them to be able to do that because they'd have to leave in the winter and go where she could have medical attention. But my grandfather homesteaded 640 acres from just east of the outlet over to Red Rock Pass, and we had that in the family for many years. My grandfather did start selling in the 60s when my grandmother was ill, so back along the lake there would be pieces sold that Em and Benson would buy to pay a doctor bill for grandma. And a lot of it, when I was growing up, it was just my playground. I had 640 acres to go play and do what I wanted to, and the difference was there were no other kids around, so you had to have a good imagination. The things I think about for me in this area is that the work that was involved in the diversity that people had to use in order to make it here. We were not ranchers. We ran cattle. We had Crystal's rodeo ring on our property for many years. We had their cattle on our property for many years, and we're still leasing our property for cattle. We didn't have power in our house or running water until I was 13, so I kind of feel like I spanned a couple of generations. But the work that went into the property is, I think, what all of us really appreciate, because I don't think there's many of us that can do that work today and maintain and still have the joy of it that my parents, my family had. And I have lots of stories, but I think this one is kind of nice. It's something my father wrote for the newspaper years ago. He came when he was, there's some pictures up there, they tented for a while, and then after they realized there was that piece to be homesteaded, my grandfather walked it and did the monuments on it to make his claim. But prior to that, they would come through here from Butte to Salt Lake because my grandmother's family was, or my grandfather's family was in the Salt Lake area, Park City area. My grandmother's was in Butte, and so they would go back and forth between there each winter. One year they'd work in the mines in Butte, and the next winter they'd go down and work at Anaconda in outside of Salt Lake. But this is kind of a little overview of what it was like when my father was here, which was in 1931, and he was 7 at the time, but they camped prior to that, coming and going. And he said, when we first moved to this part of the world, we lived in the old Targhee stage house near Henry's Lake and on Targhee Creek, which belonged to Lou Jones. It's the old stage station just east of Targhee Creek Bridge. My cousin and I liked to play in the barn. That was on the other side of the creek, and many days of fantasy were spent being cowboys. When Dad and my uncles would help Chet Ellicott on the Slashy Ranch, which is just down the creek, put up hay, we kids would run ahead of the mowers and scare the birds out of the grass. At that point, Dad found out there was ground still open for homesteading, and he filed on it and proved up. For the first 2 years, we lived in tents and cooked over an open fire. And when I read that, I have to think of my grandma in a wheelchair and not able to move, but she loved it. He says, I remember we built the cabin and it felt like a mansion. And one of the pictures up there that says the first cabin, because it wasn't as big as this room. In those days, the day's limit for fish was 20 pounds and 1 fish. Grouse were all over, the cranes were on the flats by the hundreds, as were the curlews. And I love that to this day. That's one of my things, sitting on the porch and hearing the cranes in the morning when they're trilling. It's like a time machine. He says they were on the flats by the hundreds. Proving up on the last homestead taken out on Henry's Lake Flat proved a wonderful life. While we were at the Targhee house, Al Frazier, Bruce Frazier, and Tuffy Wolf would ride over on their horses and show off for my sister and 2 girl cousins. It was a great thrill for us aspiring cowboys. When my cousin and I had to go for milk and eggs, we liked to go to Pete and Mrs. Ron instead of the McGinns. And I don't know if anybody of you heard the story of the big McGinn's ghost. Ask some of the old timers about it. Mrs. Ron always gave us fruit instead of candy, and that was a rarity up here, even when I was growing up, to have fresh vegetables and fresh fruit, although my grandfather did grow lettuce like others did. My dad and him also had a sawmill on our property that they take the logs off of the property and sell it to the different areas around that needed it. We ran pigs. I remember I was just little, that Grandpa would let the pigs go in the morning, and then about 4 in the afternoon, he'd make me stand off to the side up by the house because he'd start banging the pans, and pigs would come squealing from across the Meadow Creek Road all the way over. So there was diversification with that. Then when I was born, my dad started staying here and plowing snow on the highway till he retired. He says fishing was always excellent, but since we fished for food instead of counting, we always quit when we had enough to feed the family. I remember reading the book, The White Indian Boy, and realizing I was living where some of the events took place. Grandpa Laird, I'm sure a lot of you know, not really, our grandpa told us of the Indian women fishing on the river on our place and showed us a couple of the graves. I remember bobcats sitting on the chicken coop roof when we'd go out to let their chicks out, and the sound of a mountain lion screaming on Sawtelle. And in the fall, when the game came down, the wolves howled. The wolves were the only time our German Shepherd came to the door and scratched to come in the cabin. Other sounds that are nostalgic to me are grass growing, not just one here and there, but constantly. And as a kid, my grandpa and my dad taught me how to hunt and fish. And back on the meadow behind the outlet, there's a spot that we'd go over there and we'd just get really quiet, and then you'd start hearing that drumming of those grouse. And that was when my dad would say, okay, just be quiet, hold still, and pretty soon they'd take off, and that was dinner. Trout and grouse. Other sounds that are nostalgic, the sound of the first log hitting the saw at Stotter's Mill every morning about a mile away over on Bootjack Pass. He and a friend, he tells a story of him and a friend who were 14 and 12, hiked over Two Top by themselves. The scariest thing that they had to deal with were not the bears, but the mosquitoes. Then he says there was the rock quarry workers who stayed in my grandfather's cabins. They quarried the rock out in Garner Canyon, and I remember them because I had a puppy love crush on one of their daughters. I also recall the days in the lettuce field on Jesse Creek, the days in the woods cutting firewood with corral poles, our way of making a living. Then, during the Second World War, the government actually confiscated our property, and I don't know how many of you have seen those. I don't even know if they're still there this year, but they were concrete bunkers that were just across from Valley View, and they were going to train the soldiers for winter fight there, and it never came about because of the swamps. It was a protected bird, and they couldn't use it. So my grandfather got the property back, and about that time, my dad was in the Air Force, and then they came back up. He said, when I got out of the Air Force and got home to my beloved Henry's Lake Flat, I had a wife and 2 sons, but that's another memory. That when you grow up here, there's a sense of belonging and ownership and protectiveness that you have about the land, and seeing it go so different is difficult because on my own property, when my father's cousins, nephews, and nieces inherited, they all sold their property. And it's very difficult because when you've lived on that property and all of your childhood memories are there, you have a spot here, there's the frog heaven, and that's what, there's just places that you do not forget. And then you realize at some point, you can't go there, that's not your place anymore. So I think all of us have those connections to the property, to the land, to protecting it from so much development, because it's basically pushing so many of the animals away from places. We've always had them coming through our yards, or, you know, you sit at the river and they come walking up the river and you've just got this wonderful paradisaic feeling when you're there. And so hopefully with the Land Conservancy, we get to keep more to where it is now instead of it always turning into neighborhoods, because that's hard to watch. But growing up here, it's been one of the best things for me. It taught me a lot of strengths that I think a lot of women don't have. If I was going to drive, my dad said I had to know how to fix the car on the way to school, which was Ashton. When I was little, he let me drive this old Studebaker all over our property, and I could hardly reach the pedals. The caveat was, if you're going to drive it and anything happens, you've got to get yourself out of the fix, because I'm not coming to do it. So as you go through, I have children of my own and grandchildren, and they're all connected to this land, because this is where we came for vacation. We'd stay in my grandpa's old cabin, didn't have water, didn't have an electric stove. We used the wood stove. I'd take the kids down to the river at night, and I'd bath them up and hold the girls up by their feet and let their hair wash down through the river. So there's just so many memories that you have, and there's no way to put it in such a short space of time. But for those who really appreciate what Island Park is, and should stay, let your voice be heard. Thank you.
Going on, let's talk about the Johnson and Empty Ranch. And for that, we have Deborah who's going to speak to that, and thank you so much.
So I'm probably maybe one of the people whose family actually had a dream of buying a piece of property and being able to accomplish that. Our ranch is on the west side of Henry's Lake, and it was the old Fred Kelly Ranch, and it's comprised of 3 homesteads that were put together sometime as a ranch before Fred acquired it. We have it was the Robbins Place, the Sherman, which is our Sherman Meadow, and the Gilman, or the Gillen, which is our north piece of property. And so my dad, he grew up in Marysville, Idaho, just down the hill, and his family, they were farmers, but his mom and dad believed everybody should be educated. So he sent everybody to college, and they became doctors and colonels and things like that. But my dad just wanted to be a rancher, and so they said, well, you still have to go to college. So they sent him to Logan, and he got he was in an animal science program there. And that's kind of important to our ranch, because without that, it wouldn't have probably been able to turn into a reality. But while he was there, he met a young guy in school too, and he was from New York City, and his name was Eddie Seidman. And Eddie was thrilled with the western landscape and ranching and stuff, and so they had this scheme that they were going to get together and buy a ranch together. So my dad heard about the piece of property on the west side of the lake being for sale, and so when summer vacation started, they decided to drive Eddie's very fancy car up and go check out this ranch. And so none of the roads are, of course, where they are now. And when they got to Henry's Lake, it was just grass and sagebrush and rocks. So my dad would walk in front of Eddie's car, looking for rocks and stuff as they traveled to the back side of the lake. And so when they got there, they said, well, we understand that you have this ranch for sale. and we'd like to buy it. And they said, well, you have to work here for a little while. So they worked there for 3 days, and they got ready to leave, and they were really disappointed because nobody mentioned whether they could buy the ranch or anything, and they packed their stuff in the car, and they got ready to leave, and Fred came out, and he said, well, we just talked it over really quickly, and you know, we like you fellows, and you can buy the ranch. So Eddie's dad, he funded Eddie's half of it, and my dad, he got a loan, and he got help from his mom and dad. And so, you know, they were able to purchase the ranch. And my dad went into the service right after that, and he had to have somebody else run the ranch for a few years. But when he got out, Eddie decided he was done with ranching, and so my dad was able to buy the other half of the ranch at that particular time. So he was young, single cowboy, you know, just living what he thought was an ideal life up there. And there are several homestead buildings on the ranch, and on the Gillen home, on the Gillen property, there was a pretty good square building. So I think it was probably like November or December. He decided that he wanted a little bigger house, so they put this building on some runners, and he had a team of horses, and he brought the building from the north part of the property. And then when they got to the yard, they switched the runners around, and he backed with a team of horses this building up so that the doors were adjacent, and they just fit perfectly. And that was kind of how our family home started when I was a kid. So a couple of things that are probably unique about